Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this broadcast on the Evolution Network. I am Joseph Potter, and with me today is Chris Ransom of Draft Utopia, and this is going to be a day that there was a lot going on in the NFL
that lives in
this
infamy
week.
for the Houston Texans.
Yeah, the Houston Texans got hit hard on the injury front. Their rookies benched, and midway through the show, we've got upsets in the top 25 in the NCAA football. It's just, Chris, this was one of those weeks where you just kind of wondered if anything else can go wrong. Seemed everything that was supposed to go right just went right down the toilet, and the J.J. Watt injury was just the peak of everything that could have gone wrong this weekend.
Yeah, a lot went wrong for Houston. They got a double whammy when you consider that Watt and Whitney Mercilus both suffered season-ending injuries. Mercilus suffered a torn pectoral muscle. He is done for the year. They said his injury was probable at the beginning of the game, but he did not return. They found out later it was a torn pectoral muscle. He's done for the year. There was the injury with J.J. Watt, which is potentially career-ending, and the Astros lost. So Houston got it really rough yesterday. The Texans lost too. So, yeah, this is not the time to be checking up on your Houston friends. If you got any friends that are fans of Houston sports teams, they're going through a lot right now. So try to be considerate towards that as well. But the big story among those four things, whether it's the Texans or Astros losing, Mercilus getting uninjured reserve, or Watt getting uninjured, the big story, the big headline is J.J. Watt getting injured. That's going to overshadow everything, even the brilliant play of the quarterbacks in this game, which we'll get to a little bit later in the show.
Yeah, Watt fractured his tibial plateau and his left leg. You don't have to be a doctor to know that anything having to do with the tibia, especially in the plateau area, is not only potentially career-threatening, but possibly life-altering. Thankfully, for him personally, this was only a fracture. If it would have been a break, then his career would have most definitely been over.
Yeah, but it makes you wonder if the Texans are going to release him, because this is 2 years in a row he's suffered these season-ending injuries. And I don't want to see the Texans release him, but I also understand that they might from a business standpoint when you consider how his injury's been sort of a liability these last 2 years, even though J.J. Watt is so good, great. He's one of the best football players when healthy. And J.J. Watt, it's so unfortunate that this had to happen to him. It's like, of all the players in the NFL you didn't want this to happen to, you don't want this to happen to anyone, but of all the players in the NFL, this is probably the player that's at the very top of that list of you don't want to see this happen to, because all the money he raised for Harvey, all the community events he's done for this city, this is the one guy you don't want to see go down with any injury like this.
Yeah, and I'll go and say, no, that wasn't a video I was listening to as I was watching J.J. Watt injury. That was an actual ambulance going by. I live right across from the emergency building. And you have to realize, him a standing ovation, there were people in the crowd crying. It was almost like a lot of people were wondering, because in his last injuries, he walked off on his own, off the field. So itself is one of those things that you look at and say, his career was short, but this might be the end of it. I mean, 3 Defensive Player of the Year awards. Is this the end of the road for J.J. Watt?
It probably is, and I hate to say that because J.J. Watt has just been so awesome for Houston. He's given them everything they could have wanted and then some. And this is the one player in the NFL you don't want this to happen to. You don't want this to happen to anyone, but Watt's been such a role model for the league that this takes a dent on the NFL's image and morale, losing this guy to injury. So, and Watt's 28. He will turn 29 in the offseason. And there were people saying J.J. Watt would only play until he was like 30 or 31 instead of 35 because of how the injuries have taken a toll over the last 2 years prior to this injury, along with the fact that Watt just seems like a guy who's going to retire early to avoid a concussion. So, yeah, Watt might even retire. He might not even be traded. He might end up choosing to retire on his own terms.
Yeah, and this isn't to downplay the other major injury that happened this weekend. Was Odell Beckham Jr. suffered a fractured ankle in New York's loss. So
all the Giants receivers left that game injured. Brandon Marshall left that game injured. Sterling Shepard left that game injured.
Yeah, and from what NFL insider Ian Rappaport is reporting, the injury and its nature, as well as where the Giants are in the standings, we may not see Odell Beckham again this year.
Well, I mean, with all those receivers down, Eli has to throw to Ingram, and if he's not open, he doesn't really have anybody to throw to. He's not a guy who can take off and run. And Erect Flowers is just going to look there cluelessly like he's juggling something because his pass protection is so terrible. He's just going to look at Eli like he's juggling when in the huddle, now that Eli has no weapons to throw to, because all 3 of those players are injured. We don't know the extent of those injuries yet. We know that Odell's out for the year. He is the best of those 3 receivers, so that's obviously a big loss. Brandon Marshall might be a blessing in disguise that he's gone because he's underperformed all year. And Sterling Shepard, he takes pressure off of Beckham. So if he's gone for any significant period of time, that's going to hurt the Giants. The one player on the Giants who did emerge at wide receiver yesterday is Roger Lewis, the former Bowling Green wide receiver that we raved about coming out of the 2016 or 2015 NFL draft. I can't remember which one of those drafts, but he's a Bowling Green wide receiver, and we were both really high on him as a sleeper. That's the one guy who stepped up. And Roger Lewis is going to need to step up and be the man because with those 3 receivers injured, it's basically all on him and Ingram at this point.
Yeah, and also Travis Kelce is now in the NFL's concussion protocol for Kansas City, which is devastating because his season, he was having one of the best seasons that
I don't think
he could possibly have for a tight end.
Chris Conley did suffer a season-ending injury. The Chiefs wide receiver, Conley.
Ruptured Achilles tendon.
Yep. So that's another big injury that happened this week.
Yeah, I think the injuries right now, Haloti Ngata is out. Joseph, and that's for the Lions. Joseph Barksdale was out. Thankfully, he'll probably be back. It turns out it was just a cramp. Yeah, go figure. Big guy gets taken out by a cramp. But he was out for the Chargers. Lane Johnson did not return after suffering a head injury, so he may end up being concussion protocol for the Eagles.
Gronkowski was out this week for the Patriots. He should be back next week, though.
Yeah, Ahkello Witherspoon for the 49ers, the cornerback, is out with a concussion. Luke Joeckel for the Seahawks did play, but he's expected to go under knee surgery for his bye week. Devontae Adams for the Green Bay ended up with a concussion. Terrence West went down with a calf injury. Jeremy Maclin actually played, thankfully. Keep going up. I'm just going up the list right now. Charles Clay was carted off for Buffalo. Clay was having an amazing season with a knee injury, and he did not return.
Some of these players may end up coming back next week. So
yeah, but I mean, with the amount of players that got carted off, it's, this is, usually we have a couple of significant injuries. I mean, right now, it's, come on, man. I mean, I'm looking at NFL.com. They got 12 different injuries listed.
Yeah, I'm pulling up the inactives for week 5, and then there's separate injuries for this week.
Yeah, it just has 12 categories. I mean, the injuries are like 15, 16 significant injuries. This is absurd. So, we can go down through the rest of the injuries. You're going to pull those up as we go through the games. Because I'm sure you're going to end up finding more than we have right now so far, and we could probably spend a lot of time on this.
Ryan Khalil got injured against the 49ers. He's missed the past 4 games. We've downplayed that injury big time because it's like nobody ever said anything about this in the media because he's an offensive lineman, but he's one of the better centers in the NFL when healthy. So, yeah.
Yeah, and getting to the scores, we have New England beating Tampa Bay 19-14. Jameis Winston led the game in passing, 26 for 46, 334 yards and a touchdown. Doug Martin with 13 rushes, 74 yards, continues to impress in his second game back with a touchdown. Deshaun Jackson with 5 receptions, 106 yards, all for Tampa Bay, all led the game in their respective positions. Tom Brady threw for 303 yards and a touchdown.
He tied Brett Favre and Peyton Manning for most career wins in the NFL as well, and can break that record next week against the New York Jets in New York. And if he doesn't break it then, he could break the record against the Falcons in week 7 because those are the Patriots' next 2 games, a road game against the Jets and then a home game against the Falcons. And so he'll probably break that record. I think the biggest reason the Patriots won, though, was due to the special teams with Gostkowski making all his kicks and Nick Folk missing everything within plain sight. And I knew that Nick Folk was probably going to get cut soon because the only kick he made versus the Giants last week was the game winner, and that's why he hung up to his job by a thread. And then this week you saw him Nick Folk miss every field goal within plain sight. If he makes the field goals, we're looking at overtime or potentially even Tampa Bay winning this game. If he makes the 3 field goals he misses, Tampa Bay wins this game because New England played very sloppy offensively. Brady had a turnover and a fumble, whereas Tampa Bay just simply couldn't execute in the end zone on 3rd down situations. Both teams played very sloppy offensively. Devin McCourty, I think, was the best player in this game. 11 tackles plus a breakup, which prevented a second Tampa Bay touchdown. I think he had the best game, and everyone was saying this Patriots defense couldn't step up. They held Tampa to 14 points. Devin McCourty steps up. Hightower's back from his injury. And even Tampa Bay to hold New England to under 20 points without Levante David or Quan Alexander at linebacker is extremely impressive. So there's that. And New England's 3-2. They get the Jets next week, and Tampa Bay is 2-2. They'll play in week 6. They get, I think it's a home game. I'm double checking right now because I do have playoffpredictors.com loaded, and that's where I keep track of all the simulations and stuff. I'm not going to They play Arizona on the road in Week 6, and I actually think Tampa Bay wins that game this year.
And
so I think both teams can win next week.
Yeah, and that's really good stuff. We're going to move on to the next game, which is the first Sunday game, a game I don't think anybody expected any headlines to come out of that ended up having a lot of headlines come out of it, and that's the Jets defeating the Browns. With this win, according to Seth Walder of ESPN Analytics, the New York Jets now have a better chance of reaching the playoffs at 1.1% than landing the number 1 overall pick at 0.4% in next year's draft. Almost certainly neither will happen, but it probably is time to put the first pick watch to bed for Todd Bowles' team. The Jets still have a 35% chance of earning a top 5 pick in the draft.
Yeah, I noticed this a few weeks ago. I pointed out how the Jets weren't going to get the number 1 pick because I went over the Niners' schedule, and I had them losing to the Colts. Even without Andrew Luck, I had the 49ers losing to the Colts. And at that point, I said, well, the 49ers, their strength of schedule is weaker than the Jets, and I think they're going to lose more games. So 2 weeks ago, I went back to the board and adjusted my mock and said, well, we're going to put the Niners at 1 because we didn't know they owned the head-to-head tiebreaker over the Jets for a weaker strength of schedule, which grants them the number 1 pick. And we also didn't think the Jets were going to beat any of the teams they beat. We thought this team would be an 0-5 team in the preseason, and the Jets have been using that 0-16 fuel, and they put an 0-16 poster up in their locker room before the year, and they have been using that as motivation since week 2 when they lost to the Raiders, because all the experts said they'd go 0-16. So after that Raiders loss, Todd Bowles put an 0-16 poster up in the Jets' home locker room. They've won every game since that point. So just saying that motivation tactic really worked for the Jets, and I think it's time you're going to get on board with me and say the Niners are probably the team in the driver's seat to land the number 1 pick, unless you think this Browns team has a shot at doing that.
Well, here is another one of the news stories that were coming out of it. The Browns defense yesterday, we got our first look at the Browns front 4 at full strength with with Myles Garrett coming back and
Ogba
winning.
And so yeah,
it was with Garrett starting, and Garrett on his first play of his first career snap and his first day got a sack. Garrett finished the day with 2 sacks. The defense held the Jets to 14 points, played extremely well the entire day, limited Elijah McGuire to 20 yards, Ardarius Stewart to 12 yards. Bilal Powell, who everybody said was going to have a great game, was limited to 5 yards. So that Cleveland front 4 at full strength.
They limited the Jets' entire running game to 18 carries for 34 rushing yards, because if you count the -3 rushing yards by Josh McCown, that cancels out the 37 total yards. And I really don't acknowledge the running game unless the running back or the entire running game gets over 100 yards, a touchdown. The Browns' run defense just stepped up, like you said, and I think both secondaries had some moments as well, because McCourty picked off a pass for the Browns, and I think the Jets secondary just showed up to play in this game. I had Morris Claiborne. He had 9 tackles for a loss, 2 deflections, an interception. Jamal Adams led the Jets with 9 tackles. Marcus May had the interception off Kaiser. Claiborne had the interception off Hogan. So that nucleus, that Jets secondary, Morris Claiborne, I thought he was a number 2 corner at best, but he has played like a number 1 corner this year, and he's turned out to be one of the better signings so far for the New York Jets. So I don't understand why Tony Mario gave the Jets a corner in the 2nd round with Morris Claiborne playing this well, but maybe they can put that guy next to Claiborne and get something out of him and then really take the secondary to a whole new level, because right now teams are discounting what Claiborne can do. Maybe that's due to Cleveland not having any good receivers. Maybe that's due to Claiborne just being that good of a corner. That's debatable. I mean, maybe Claiborne can have another strong game against the Patriots next week, because this New England team does not have Julian Edelman And if Claiborne plays like he did versus the Browns, the Jets have a chance. So we'll see what Claiborne does. We'll see what Adams and May do, but the secondary really stepped up for the Jets. I think that was the key takeaway that the Jets deserve credit for, but that got overshadowed by the media because the media wanted to focus on Kaiser, the Cleveland Browns' big investment at quarterback getting benched, because that creates the emotional intelligence, that stirs the conversation, that creates a much bigger storyline. And you know the NFL is all about selling good storylines.
Well, Chris, Chris, you're echoing.
I'm not echoing.
Okay. But the big thing that you can take away from this is that, yes, Kaiser is the huge story in this case because, and rightfully so, because the Browns said, we're going to stick with him. We're going to stick with him. Nothing's changed. He's our starter. He's our guy this year. Nothing's going to go wrong. We're going to go with him through the good and the bad. And this has been the rhetoric for nearly 6 weeks, is that everything Kaiser's going to do, he's going to learn on the fly. And yes, DeShone Kizer has showed that he is an NFL caliber quarterback. But DeShone Kizer has also shown that he is an extremely raw rookie. DeShone Kizer has also shown that he shouldn't have started at the beginning of the year. He should have been allowed to learn and watch the films and watch an older player play. It doesn't matter if it was even a second-year player. To sit and watch. He's only 21 years old. And even in his press conference yesterday, post-game, he was showing maturity and grace, even though that his season is, for the most part, probably over.
Yeah, he did.
And that being said,
in the press conference, but he also got so frustrated during the game with his receivers that I think he said the F word and Jesus Christ when walking back to the sideline.
Yeah, and I could see this building for the last couple weeks, his frustration, because, and I don't even think it's with these receivers, because even you were texting me yesterday saying these young guys that they had in there, the Ricardo Lewis, the Duke Johnson, David Njoku, Kason Williams, Bryce Triggs, and Seth DeValve, they were getting open. But Kaiser was making the wrong reads and missing receivers, most likely because he hadn't played with them. He was frustrated, and a lot of that frustration I blame on Kenny Britt, because Britt was a huge source of that frustration, and it's boiling over. Unfortunately, it may have cost Kaiser his job at this point, because Kevin Hogan came in, had a 16 for 19 day, 194 yards, 2 touchdowns. An interception came on a ball that literally went through the receiver's hands and right into the hands of a Jets defensive back.
Kevin Hogan began the game 11 for 12 with his only incompletion being the interception to Morris Claiborne, who I talked about earlier in the show, and that was due to the receiver not catching that. It wasn't due to Hogan making a bad read. That was due to the receiver making a poor reaction, and that's going to get underlooked.
So an interception and a drop accounted for 2 of the 3 incompletions from Kevin Hogan. So at this point, I think you have to start Kevin Hogan next week. I don't think you have much of a choice. Kaiser has, when you get that frustrated, you cannot function correctly. You know it, Chris. I know you've been that frustrated. I've been that frustrated. You cannot function correctly.
It's true.
And right now, Kaiser is...
You're right. Let me give you a brief example here. Last week, I think a friend messaged me something really frustrating, and I was trying to get through the recaps. I was just stressed out. I was not functioning correctly for the first hour or 2 after the 1 p.m. NFL games. That caused me to fall behind work. I got things together, got everything I need updated, but that pressure can frustrate you at times. That's my point. But go on, Joey.
Yeah. So
Kaiser,
personally,
not my personal life.
I think that Kaiser has to sit the rest of the year. He has to.
I know we were really looking forward to Deshaun Watson. That has been canceled due to Kevin Hogan.
Yeah, I think Kevin Hogan has to start at least until he gets injured. Hopefully he doesn't. But Kaiser has to sit. He has to regroup to get his mind in order. This team was not built for a rookie quarterback to start with what we have at receiver. And as a Browns fan, that frustrates me to no end.
Backfired because Brock Osweiler struggled, Cody Kessler struggled, and Kaiser dominated early in training camp. And the Browns figured, let's throw Kaiser into the fire without developing him a little bit more. And it backfired.
And that was a mistake.
It was. You even said earlier in the year that they need to let him learn the playbook this year on our July shows and our August podcasts on the Draft Utopia podcast, but the Browns apparently didn't agree with you.
Yeah, and with all this discussion, I'm just going to go out and say this is I guess we could say this is a bonus featured game because, as I said earlier, this was a game that we were just expected to skip by. We were going to mention Myles Garrett and how well the Browns front four played. We were going to mention how well or how bad Josh McCown played and how well he ended up playing. And then that was going to be it. But there are so many stories come out of this game for a game with teams that are combined 3-7. It was, we had to hit some of these points because it's just, like I said earlier, this has been a whirlwind of a week. We covered all those injuries, and even in just the Jets-Browns game, we covered a myriad of areas. So the Jets are now 3-2. The Browns are 0-5. We'll move on to the next game.
I still think the Browns can go 3-13. They've got home games against the Jaguars, the Titans, and the Ravens. I'm not sure how many of those games they win at quarterback, though, with Kevin Hogan instead of Kaiser. I think they can beat the Titans if Mariota's not back by week 7. The Jaguars is a maybe because Bortles plays hot one week, and then he plays like absolute garbage when he has to face a team he's supposed to beat, like the Jets. And then the Ravens, I'm probably going to give the Ravens a win over Cleveland now because that just seems logical at this point.
Well,
Cleveland, it's too early to say, but yeah.
It's too early to say. Moving on, we get the Bills, who are now, and the Bengals, who are now 2-3, as the Bengals go over the Bills 20-16. And there are two high headlines here. One is Micah Hyde with another interception, which makes his third in 2 weeks. Tre'Davious White played well. The entire Buffalo backfield played well. But the big story
is AJ Green. He had that big run.
AJ Green, he has to be the best receiver in the NFL at this point. Another 7 receptions, 189 yards, and a touchdown. So I'm going to ask you, AJ Green's the big news story, but who played better, AJ Green as an individual or that Buffalo secondary?
AJ Green as an individual played better because he burned Tre'Davious White on that touchdown play, and he just had a dominant day. And get this, I actually have the Bengals winning the next 2 games after their bye week. I have them beating the Steelers in Pittsburgh in week 7, and I also have them beating the Colts in week 8 at home since they won't have Andrew Luck. And that means the Bengals go from being a 5-11 team to maybe going 7-9, assuming they sweep the Browns. But they've got to win against the Jaguars or the Titans on the road or the Broncos on the road. They're going to have to steal one of those games on the road if they're going to expect to do anything in this AFC North division, with the Ravens owning the head-to-head tiebreakers over the Bengals in both games if the Ravens win in Baltimore and then they beat the Bengals in Cincinnati. So Cincinnati, they're going to have to steal one on the road here against a team like Jacksonville, Tennessee, Denver, Minnesota. If they can do something. But I think this Bengals team has a lot of momentum right now. I honestly think they are going to win these next two games against the Steelers and the Colts and improve their record to 4-3 and try to fool people into thinking they're a contender in the AFC North.
Well, I'm going to say I don't judge Tre'Davious White on getting burned by A.J. Green, but
Davis White,
my big thing is
he doesn't play well in press coverage, and he got lucky last week with Atlanta's receivers being injured. White is someone that's A.J. Green is someone that's able to exploit that weakness in White's game. Julio Jones was another guy that could exploit that, but he got injured. So did Sanu. So White sort of cruised by last week, had an awesome game, but cruised by nonetheless.
Well, here's the thing. I don't judge him for not being able to handle A.J. Green because I don't think anybody in the NFL right now can handle A.J. Green. And until somebody finds a way to at least potentially slow him down, it's going to be tough to beat the Bengals because to beat the Bengals, you're going to have to beat A.J. Green. And right now, he doesn't look like he's going to
Aaron Rodgers needs overtime to beat the Bengals, okay? That's just how sound A.J. Green's been since Bill Lazor took over at offensive coordinator. And while Lazor was absolutely horrible in Miami, he's been much better in Cincinnati, and it's almost at the point where Lazor might actually generate consideration for a head coaching gig, as ridiculous as that sounds. We thought that sounded ridiculous when Anthony Lynn took over, but he ended up getting a coaching gig, so we'll see what happens with Lazor and this Bengals team.
Yeah, and now moving on to the next game, this was one of the best games of the week, and he almost did it again. Matthew Stafford came up just a tiny bit short of a comeback victory as for the second week in a row as the Panthers down the Lions to move to 4-1. Will the Lions fall to 3-2? The Panthers win 27-24 behind Cam Newton's 355-yard, 3-touchdown game, 26 for 33. As I said in my mock draft on your podcast, the Lions are in need of a running back, being led by Amir Abdullah this week, 10 carries, 31 yards.
The Lions needed a running back in the
Dixon
draft, but they didn't get one because all of their running backs had 3 to 4 year contracts. And if that's still the case and they still have 2 years on their contract, if all these Lions running backs still have 2 years on their deal, thanks to Riddick being extended and thanks to all this with Abdullah, then the Lions need to cut some of these running backs to save money and actually go after someone. Because sitting here and putting faith in running backs who aren't that good and you've paid them all this money and you want to honor the contracts, that's not going to work if you want to win a championship for Matthew Stafford. That's laying in purgatory instead of making a move. So
yeah,
the Lions are going to be stuck in running back purgatory until they actually make a move this offseason.
Stafford had a pretty good game, 23 for 35, 229 yards, 2 touchdowns. It was a tale of X factor in this was Ed Dixon, the Carolina wide receiver, or I think he's tight end.
I think
5 receptions, 175 yards, 64 is his long. He caught all 5 targets. He was absolutely phenomenal in this game. And so I think that was the X factor in it. A very good game, potentially one of the games of the week with Carolina going over Detroit. Now,
yeah, Carolina was just awesome in this game. Cam Newton began the game 7 for 8 on his opening drive with 173 passing yards, 1 touchdown, no interceptions. Then after that, after he threw his second touchdown, he was 15 for 17 on the day. Cam Newton just began this game on an extremely accurate note, and that's amazing when you consider Ryan Khalil is injured, but Detroit didn't have Haloti Ngata either, so they couldn't really get any pressure from the interior defensive line. You wish A'Shawn Robinson would have stepped up and owned that situation because this would have been a perfect opportunity to use him as a blitzer with Khalil injured, but I'm not going to criticize the Lions. They're still in good shape to go 8-8 this year, and Carolina, this is a team that could go 10-6 and miss the playoffs. It sounds crazy, but we'll see. If they beat the Eagles on Thursday night, that's a huge game for both teams because right now I have Philadelphia ending the season with home field just based off projections. But if they lose that game, Carolina could be in the conversation for potentially home field as well. There's a lot that could happen. This NFC is just so wide open at this point this year. So that Thursday night game is going to be a much bigger game than people realize between the Panthers and the Eagles on Thursday in Carolina.
Yes, it will be. Moving on to the 0-5. Yes, I said it, 0-5. San Francisco 49ers. They fell to the Colts 26-23. The Colts are now 2-3. Brian Hoyer, 29 for 46, 353 yards, 2 touchdowns for San Francisco. Max had 9 carries, 91 yards, and a touchdown, while T.Y. Hilton once again had a dominant performance at wide receiver for Indianapolis, 7 receptions, 177 yards, as the Colts beat San Francisco in overtime to move to 2-3.
Ryan Kelly did return. He had a hip injury that was going to cause him to miss 6 to 8 weeks back in the preseason. He made his return in this game, came back from that injury much earlier than people anticipated. I think that's a huge reason why you saw both Marlon Mack and Frank Gore have big runs on the ground. And the Colts had over 100 rushing yards combined, but neither back got them 100 yards. So I think that's really a credit to Kelly returning because Kelly only gave up a half a sack as a rookie. I don't think he even gave up a single sack as a rookie because Ryan Kelly just gave that Colts offensive line stability. Even though Costanzo was a good piece, Kelly gave them that stability. And with Kelly and Costanzo back, Costanzo looked like the old left tackle that earned that contract extension when playing with Andrew Luck. So it's going to be interesting to see if the Colts can build and adapt around this next week. They get the Titans on Monday Night Football. And if Marcus Mariota or Andrew Luck isn't playing next Monday night, John Gruden might want to take cyanide pills during the game. I mean, it's going to be that brutal without Luck or Mariota on Monday night.
Yeah, and the next game features the Titans falling to the Dolphins 16-10. The Dolphins are now 2-2. The Titans are 2-3. But the big story coming out of this is the Dolphins offensive line coach, Chris Forrester, has resigned.
Yeah, and if you're wondering why he resigned, we could talk about Rashad Jones being clutch, but neither Matt Castle or Jay Cutler warrants a reward or a group photo like the media is making it out to be because both quarterbacks played poorly. Chris Forrester was a candidate to possibly be promoted, and Chris Forrester wasn't just the offensive line coach, Joey. He was also the running game coordinator in practice. He did so well with this unit last year that he actually got promoted to running game coordinator as well. So, but he did snort cocaine. It was on videotape. A female videotaped it. That's why he resigned, and that's why everyone's making such a big deal out of this. But did you know about Forrester getting promoted to running game coordinator really quickly before he resigned?
No, that was something that was new to me. I knew he was the offensive line coach, but I did not know he had been promoted. But sniffing cocaine is not a way to celebrate your promotion.
No,
it's a way to get you fired really quick.
No, it isn't. But does this affect Miami's running game now? Because now they don't have that running game coordinator.
Well, not only do they not have the running game coordinator, they don't have the offensive line coach either. So
exactly.
the Miami's going to have to figure out how they're going to do this, and they're going to have to figure it out in short notice because that running game is one of the few highlights of this season that they had.
I would actually consider bringing back Jake Long as an offensive line coach, not a player, but a coach to mentor the guys. It sounds crazy, Joey, but that's what I would do if I were Miami's GM in this situation. Just roll the dice, bring Long in, and pray to heck that this works.
Yeah, and
I don't think it will, but it's a desperate situation. I'm desperate.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and Long was a former number 1 overall pick, so it's not like he doesn't
mentor Laramie Tunsil, who could have been number 1 had it not been for the pot incident with the Darth Vader mask or whatever. But moving on.
Yeah. So moving on, you're correct. We got a game that I actually picked correct. which is something I don't do too often, and that is the Chargers beating the Giants 27-22. The Chargers now moved to 1-4, while the Giants linger at 0-5. Had a lackluster game, going 21 of 44, 258 yards, but he did have 3 touchdowns. Melvin Gordon had an excellent game for the Chargers, 20 rushes, 105 yards, while Odell Beckham had 5 receptions, 97 yards, and a touchdown before going down with that injury that we talked about earlier that will keep him out for the year.
Yeah, and this is a rough blow for the Giants because this causes me to adjust their projection from 8-8 following this loss to 5-11, because not having Odell the rest of the year means the Giants lose to Seattle at home. They might beat the Rams at home, but they're going to lose to Seattle. They'll probably get swept by Philadelphia and Dallas now without Odell Beckham. And that puts the Giants in a precarious 5-11 position rather than an 8-8 position. And that would give the Giants a high draft pick, though. So we'll see where the Giants end up when the season ends, but that adjusts their projected record. I also have the Chargers at 5-11, not that it matters, but I think the player that really stepped up in this game was Melvin Gordon. Melvin Gordon had 105 rushing yards, and he also had 58 receiving yards on 6 receptions with 2 receiving touchdowns. Melvin Gordon had over 34 points for me in fantasy football in my PPR league yesterday on Yahoo. So he was huge and very paramount in that win for me. Another guy who was huge for me in that fantasy win was Leonard Fournette, who had 31 fantasy points. So I'm guessing that's the next game on our list, but let's talk about this game for a second. All 3 of the Giants receivers are injured. Melvin Gordon steps up. The Chargers get the Raiders next week without Derek Carr. So this is a chance for the Chargers to build on that momentum, because the Raiders without Carr looked absolutely lost. We'll get to that game later, but the Chargers have a chance to build some momentum. They have a window of opportunity, as crazy as it sounds, because they get Denver at home in Week 7 with Mike Williams back that week. So there's a window of opportunity for the Los Angeles Chargers to build some momentum. They're not going to be a playoff team, but there is a window of opportunity for this team to build some momentum and maybe do something with it.
Yeah, there is, and I think they're an incredibly talented team, but how far they will go is hard to tell. The next game, we're just going to touch over real quick. We're not going to get in depth with. The Eagles go 4-1. The Cardinals fall to 2-3 as the Eagles trounce the Cardinals 34-7. Carson Wentz 21 for 30, 304 yards, 4 touchdowns.
Early.
Nelson Aguilar 4 receptions, 93 yards, and a touchdown. What were you going to say, Chris?
I was going to say that Carson Wentz pretty much buried Arizona with his 3 passing touchdowns in the first quarter. He got Hurts involved. He got Torrey Smith involved. He got Jeffrey involved. He got Blunt involved. And the offensive tackles, Jason Peters and Lane Johnson, have continued to play brilliantly for Carson Wentz. And Eagles are looking really smart now for extending Jason Peters, giving him that 3-year extension, which we thought they wouldn't do, but they did, and they're looking really smart for it. It's paying off so far.
Yeah, yes, they are. And next game is the Jaguars go to 3-2. Steelers fall to 3-2. But the big takeaway from this game, Leonard Fournette carries 28 times, 181 yards, 2 touchdowns, as the Jaguars win 30-9. Ben Roethlisberger with 5 interceptions, and interview with Roethlisberger. I mean, Roethlisberger sounds like a guy that's done.
Yeah, he does. And I think the biggest issue with the Steelers' defense is they don't have that guy like Timmons. Kevin Williams, Tyler Matakevich, those guys don't complement Shazier well. And I think it's gotten to the point where a few teams who run the ball a lot, like to run the ball a lot, have figured that out and are trying to exploit that. We saw the Chicago Bears exploit that with Jordan Howard. We saw all the Jaguars exploit that with Leonard Fournette. And with Pittsburgh having 2 games coming up versus the Bengals fresh off a bye week at Heinz Field in Week 7 and versus the Chiefs at Arrowhead in Week 6, Pittsburgh could very well be 3-4 heading into Week 8. but then they could go on a run until they play the Patriots, and then they'd lose that game but win the remaining games. I still think they can win the division, but man, this Pittsburgh team does not look like a team that has the heart.
No,
and Ben Roethlisberger, 5 interceptions, so they look.
For you, when Pittsburgh goes back to Cleveland, Cleveland's got their full defensive line. We saw how that defense played with Myles Garrett.
Cleveland in Week 17, Joey.
Yeah, but with the thing is, though, with Ben Roethlisberger being so deflated right now, could Pittsburgh just shoe it in against teams like Cleveland and such because they just don't believe they can win anymore? I mean, Roethlisberger just flat said, maybe I don't have it anymore.
He did say that after the game, but that's because he just hit a career low point. I mean, the Pittsburgh Steelers play 3 tough games coming up before the bye week, and those tough games involve the Steelers facing the – okay, so yeah. But as far as the Steelers' schedule goes, I have the Chiefs. They play the Chiefs in Week 6, the Bengals in Week 7 at Heinz Field. They get the Lions on Sunday Night Football with Detroit coming off a bye week in Week 7 before their bye week. And then they get the Colts at Heinz Field off a bye week. And Andrew Luck might be back by Week 10. That might be the game he returns because Luck's missed the last 2 years versus the Steelers. That might be the game he's back. They get the Titans on Thursday Night Football. They get the Packers on Sunday Night Football. They get the Bengals in Cincinnati on Monday night. They get Baltimore on Sunday Night Football in December. Then they host the Patriots. Then they get the Texans on Christmas Eve. And then they wrap the season up with the Browns. So this is a very intriguing situation here. And I do have Pittsburgh at 11-5. I thought I had them at 12-4, but I forgot to give the Titans the win over Pittsburgh because I do think the Titans defense is going to sneak into Pittsburgh and pull an upset on them at some point. So when taking that into account, we get 3 playoff teams from the AFC. So the Colts, the Jaguars, and Titans would all get in 9-7, 9-7, 8-8, and that would just be brutal. But Pittsburgh is just looking in a very precarious situation, and I thought they had a cakewalk of a schedule outside of New England, but they get the Chiefs, they get a red-hot Bengals team, they get a Lions team on Sunday night in Detroit. They could face Luck in Week 10 when he's back from his injury. They get the Titans on Thursday night, and with Nashville and Pittsburgh both playing in the Stanley Cup on NBC and that game being on NBC, you know Nashville's going to bring a big crowd to Heinz Field. They get the Packers. So a lot of these games are going to be primetime games except for the Patriots game, and Pittsburgh's going to have to play like a pressure team, and they're going to have to figure it out pretty quickly. I still think they're the favorite to win this division, but Baltimore and Cincinnati are gaining steam. They're gaining momentum, and they have a window of opportunity if Pittsburgh stumbles in one of these games that I've projected them to win.
Yeah, speaking of the Ravens, and the next game, the Ravens won 30-17 over the Raiders. The Ravens, who got off to a hot start, lost 2 in a row, back on the winning. They're now 3-2. Raiders dropped to 2-3.
I think
Flacco with a good game with 19 for 224.
Jimmy Smith. Ronnie Stanley held Khalil Mack in check all game, giving Flacco time in the pocket. Jimmy Smith had a fumble recovery for a touchdown, plus he eliminated Amari Cooper to 1 reception for 6 yards, which is a career low for Amari Cooper in the NFL. So Jimmy Smith was able to limit Amari Cooper to 6 yards on 1 reception, which is amazing that any corner in the NFL can limit Cooper to that few receiving yards. And that just shows you how dysfunctional this Raiders team is without Derek Carr, their leader and their quarterback. And it sucks, but I have the Ravens and the Broncos with head-to-head tiebreakers over the Raiders if both teams go 8-8. And that's what could ultimately keep Denver out of the playoffs, or Oakland for that matter. So it's really too early to say with this many 8-8 teams in the mix, but we'll see what happens. But Denver's got a good thing going with their bye week. Oakland has Derek Carr out right now, and that's not good because the Raiders host the Chargers next week, and they've got to win that game without Carr in order to save their season. If they don't, them going 7-9 isn't out of the question. If Carr misses this game in the Chiefs game, the Raiders going 7-9 isn't out of the question because I have Denver sweeping them, and if they lose these home games to the Chargers and the Chiefs these next 2 weeks, which are huge division games, the Raiders might go 7-9. It sounds crazy, Joey, but Derek Carr is the heart of this team, and they don't have the linebackers to stop the run. So if they lose Derek Carr for any extended period, that alters their outlook completely as a football team. And Baltimore, they've got a shot at a wild card now because of their schedule.
Yeah, and moving on, we got Seattle beating the Rams 16-10. Jared Goff with his worst outing of the year, finishing 22 of 47, 288 yards, 2 touchdowns. Todd Gurley, 14 carries, 43 yards. Their Rams offense just looked anemic in this game. Seattle wins 16-10.
Jared Goff had some momentum at the end of the game, but Cooper Kupp dropped a huge touchdown pass on 3rd down near the end of the game. And outside of that final drive, Jared Goff looked like garbage the entire game, but I don't think that's all necessarily on Goff. I think we're not giving enough credit to Earl Thomas. And Earl Thomas had a huge game for Seattle. Earl Thomas, he had 7 solo tackles, which was second on the team behind Bobby Wagner. He had a pass deflection for a breakup. He had a forced fumble that prevented a Todd Gurley rushing touchdown. And that fumble was recovered by Nico Thorpe or Sheldon Richardson, but Sheldon Richardson had a fumble that was recovered by Nico Thorpe. But my point is that fumble recovery negated a Todd Gurley, that forced fumble that Earl Thomas had negated a Todd Gurley touchdown, which would have gave the Rams a 17-16 win had they got that touchdown. And then you got the interception he had off Jared Goff. He was one of 2 players to intercept Jared Goff outside of Sheldon Richardson. And Sheldon Richardson also had a fumble recovery. So Sheldon Richardson did a great job getting pressure on Goff on the interior. And Earl Thomas was able to have a big game as well. So you can make a case for Richardson or Earl Thomas, both of those guys having huge days for Seattle. Wagner really stepped up. Sherman had no deflections, but he blanketed.
It was a good game overall for Seattle's defense, and they held the Rams to 10 points and really hurt the Rams offense in that regard.
The NFC West now because they host the Rams later in the year. They'll win that game. I figured the Rams could steal one from Seattle again, but they don't. So the Rams might be an 8-8 team at best, and Seattle probably gets this division at 10-6 now. Really too early to say, but the West still goes through Seattle. Moving on.
And we need to move on. The Green Bay Packers beat the Dallas Cowboys 35-31. I wanted to get more into this game. We're running short on time here, but Ezekiel Elliott had 29 carries for 116 yards as the Packers move to 4-1, where the Cowboys fall to 2-3.
Dallas had some great drives early in this game where they just executed, and it looked like this game was going to go from Kerm celebrating and Lisa wanting to hurt Joe Buck to Lisa being stoked at the end and Kerm receiving a huge letdown from his Dallas Cowboys. So Aaron Rodgers was just that clutch in this game, and he made some excellent throws. And that's really all we can say about this game due to time constraints.
Yeah, he made some good throws. Moving on, we got the Chiefs beating the Texans last night. We've already mentioned a lot about that Texans team, so we're just going to go ahead and mention these quarterbacks real quick. Alex Smith, 29 for 37, 324 yards, 3 touchdowns. Really I saw a couple excellent plays from Smith where he's just playing excellent ball now, despite what any detractors may say. And
I think the ball control is something I want to touch on really quickly. In the first half, the Kansas City Chiefs had the football for 21 minutes and 35 seconds. They had the ball for 10 minutes and 56 seconds in the first quarter, and they had the ball for 10 minutes and 39 seconds in the second quarter. So if you add those times up per quarter, the time of possession is 21 minutes and 35 seconds out of 30 minutes in the first half. That's how long the Chiefs had the ball. And the Texans didn't have Watt or Merciless after the opening drive. So that it's amazing that they were able to hold the Chiefs to field goals early in that game when you consider how depleted their defense was.
And not only that, but Deshaun Watson only completed 16 passes, but 5 of them were touchdowns. So Watson is proving to be a touchdown machine in Houston at the moment.
Playing smart. He might not be developing that pinpoint accuracy that you want in a quarterback, but he's playing smart and he's avoiding turnovers. And the big issue with Watson coming out of Clemson was, would he avoid turnovers in the NFL? And he's answered that question and passed with flying colors, even if he's not making the most accurate throws. I don't care about him being accurate right now. He's a rookie. He's learning the system. And if he's avoiding interceptions and playing smart, you just want him to maintain that.
Yeah, he is doing everything that's asked of him right now. And nobody can say anything bad about him at this point. Moving on to college football at the moment, we have the big headline is Oklahoma losing to Iowa State. And right now, it's Kyle Kemp had a great game, 343 yards, 3 touchdowns, quarterback from Iowa State.
Kyle Kemp is the backup. Their starter had to take a medical leave for personal reasons, and Kyle Kemp got the start, and he had a huge debut.
Yeah, he did. He 343 yards, 3 touchdowns, 18 for 24 passing. Trey Sermon from Oklahoma, the running back, 18 carries, 90 yards. And Trevor Ryan was the leading receiver on the game, 4 receptions, 99 yards, 1 touchdown for Iowa State.
Iowa State's got a running back that might be a 2019 prospect that Tony told me about. And Mark Suba mentioned Jack Campos, a guy Tony liked. I know an Iowa State fan who told me Campos isn't that good, but he's someone we're going to have to revisit now because Iowa State beat Oklahoma, and if they have a left tackle that's like 6'8", 300 pounds, and they didn't give up any mistakes, we got to watch his tape, and we got to revisit the situation to determine if he's an NFL prospect because Oklahoma's got a good pass rusher, and he couldn't get anything going against Iowa State. So we're going to have to check out Jack Campos, the Iowa State left tackle, when we get the chance.
Yeah, we are. I've seen a little bit of him. I'm a little bit torn on him. So we're going to see how he develops over the next year or so. That being said, Baker Mayfield is, I still say at this point, people are going to have to start talking about Baker Mayfield being the best quarterback in the nation. Even in a losing effort, he was 24 for 33, 306 yards, averaged 9.3 yards per completion, 2 touchdowns, still hasn't thrown an interception this season, had 11 carries, 57 yards, averaged 5.2 yards per carry, still got a touchdown. So right now, field, whether people like it or not, whether people are going to harp on his 6'1" size or not, he's 220 pounds. He's got a good build, 15 touchdowns, no interceptions, 1,600 passing yards on the season. It's not like he's been, just holding the ball and not throwing it or just running it. He's had 134 pass attempts. He's got 74.6% completion percentage. He's got 12 yards average per completion. He's only taken 8 sacks. He's on pace to take about 15 sacks, which would probably be anything under 18 would be the lowest of his career. He hasn't had a game anywhere under 283 yards this season, and that was against Baylor when he only played the snaps. He didn't play the entire game, I don't believe. Right now, Baker Mayfield is the best quarterback in football, and he may be the best quarterback in this upcoming draft as of right now.
Yeah, I know in Josiah Ray's mock draft that he did for the site, he gave the 49ers Josh Rosen at number 1, and he actually gave the Bengals Baker Mayfield at number 6 ahead of Sam Darnold, who he mocked the Jets at number 14.
Yeah, Sam Darnold is falling down charts.
That's something you want to see. It's like, that's something you want to see, Joey, because that's actually someone giving Baker the respect he finally deserves.
Yeah, and Baker Mayfield, everybody says, oh, he comes from a spread system. Well, a lot of quarterbacks, almost every quarterback comes from a spread system these days. Yeah. Oh, he's
Baker
6'1".
can't play under center, but Google Images has debunked that myth. So if Jeremiah or Matt Miller or anyone says he can't play under center, just show them a photo of Baker Mayfield hiking the ball under center on Google Images, and they will absolutely be speechless because the evidence is there. And when the evidence is there, we can't have national media experts slandering draft prospects when the visual evidence and photos and proof are there that the quarterback can play under center.
Yeah, and right now the Big 12 conference standings.
There's going to be a huge game versus Texas and Oklahoma next week because Baker Mayfield's coming off a loss. He's going to be extremely fired up. Played by Kansas State for most of that game, but they got lucky and managed to win overtime, and they're unbeaten in conference play. So this Texas-Oklahoma game is going to have major implications on the Big 12 championship because if Texas somehow wins, they're 3-0 in conference play. They have a 3-game lead over Oklahoma, and they're pretty much in the Big 12 championship unless they stumble to a team like TCU or Oklahoma State later in the year. Whereas Oklahoma, fed up from losing to Iowa State, that they might just go on a run and win out from this point forward and dominate their opponents, demolish them. So this is a big game for both of these teams. And this is a big Texas-Oklahoma. That's always a big rivalry in the Big 12, but this is a big game next week for both teams.
Yeah, it really is. And at this point, I'm looking at it, and this could be a huge game for, every game coming out is a huge game for Baker Mayfield. And so I look forward to see what's happening. But on to the top 25 scores. We have Alabama beating Texas A&M 27-19. Kellen Mond actually led the game in passing. The Texas A&M quarterback, he went 19 for 29, 237 yards, 1 touchdown. Damian Harris for Alabama led 14 carries, 124 yards, and a touchdown.
I watched
Calvin Ridley.
Kellen Mond looked extremely calm in the pocket despite getting little time, despite not using Christian Kirk enough in the passing game. Kellen Mond just looked extremely calm in the pocket, so I'm going to give him a lot of credit for that despite the loss.
Yeah, and Calvin Ridley comes out, has his best game in a couple weeks, 5 receptions, 68 yards. So I think Alabama had a really good game against a very tough opponent, and they come away with the victory. Now 6-0 overall, 3-0 in the SEC. Well, Texas A&M falls to 4-2. Well, going 2-1 in the SEC. Number 2, Clemson, 28. Wake Forest, 14. Clemson now 6-0 overall, 4-0 in the ACC. Wake Forest 4-2, 1-2 in the ACC. Kendall Hilton from Wake Forest led the game in passing, 14 for 30, 203 yards, 2 touchdowns. The big takeaway from this one, though, Kendall Hilton as a rusher, 24 carries, 92 yards. Does Hilton have a future, Chris, as a running back?
Yeah, and Clemson won. The only team on Clemson's schedule that's tough at this point is North Carolina State, and they had a chance to beat Clemson on a game-winning field goal last year and didn't. But if if NC State beats Clemson this year, the ACC championship would feature North Carolina State and the Miami Hurricanes. NC State, the underdog team, versus Miami. Now that's a game I'm sort of excited about if that actually ends up happening. Not saying it will, just saying that would be an exciting ACC championship matchup if Clemson stumbled versus North Carolina State, because it'd be new. It's not the usual typical ACC championship result. You usually get Clemson or Florida State winning that Atlantic division, but with Florida State's quarterback being injured and Lamar Jackson already having 2 losses, and Clemson. NC State's got a chance to be the dark horse. Otherwise, we're probably going to get Clemson versus Miami this year.
Yeah, and we already went over the Oklahoma-Iowa State game. Moving on to Penn State, who ran over Northwestern. Penn State now 6-0 in the Big Ten, all 3-0 in the Big Ten, while Northwestern falls to 2-3, 0-2 in the Big Ten. Trace McSorley, once again, having a very good game, 25 for 34, 245 yards and a touchdown, while Saquon Barkley only had 16 carries, but he had 75 yards and 2 touchdowns. This Penn State team continues to roll behind their 2 stars, and at this point, I believe we'll get into the rankings later, but I believe they'll probably be number 3 by the time we get to the rankings. And
I'm going to go out on a limb and make a prediction that the national championship now will feature Alabama beating Penn State, because I think Penn State can beat Clemson in a 1-game playoff. As crazy as it sounds, I think with Barkley, with their defense, a lot of underlooked players, I feel like they could upset a team like Clemson. Even though Clemson's got a very good defense, I feel like they're the one team in college football right now that can keep us from getting an Alabama-Clemson Part 3.
Yeah, and I could actually see that happening. So that is something we will definitely keep in mind moving forward. Number 5, Georgia just destroyed Vanderbilt. Go to 6-0, 3-0 in the SEC, 45-14.
True freshman Jake Fromm stepped up in this game. He's been awesome since taking over for the injured Jacob Eason, and Georgia also got Justin Fields, who is ESPN's #1 high school quarterback, my number 3 quarterback, but they have Georgia now has 3 5-star quarterbacks on their roster next year. This year they've got Fromm filling in for an injured Eason, but next year they're going to have 3 5-star.
Yeah, and we're going to have to look at that carefully, because all 3 of those guys are not going to stay at Georgia.
Yeah.
Number 6, Washington moves on to 6-0 as they beat Cal 38-7. Jacob Browning, 27 of 40, 215 yards, 2 touchdowns. But once again, Myles Gaskin steals the highlights for Washington as he runs for 24 times, 91 yards, 2 touchdowns. So at this point, Jacob Browning, he's not throwing the ball very far, and Myles Gaskin is stealing the show for Washington. So Browning's draft stock just continues to slide as the season goes along.
And Washington's got 2 players on their offensive line. We mentioned Trey Adams, but the other player who I mentioned in my center rankings, who actually has experience at all 5 positions on the offensive line, is Coleman Shelton. He is a communications major too on top of that. So, and he's a great communicator as well. So Coleman Shelton's a player to keep an eye on. I think Browning is a product of a really good supporting cast around him on offense. He did lose John Ross, but he still has Pettis. He still has Gaskin. He has those 2 linemen up front. I think Browning's the product of a very good offensive lineman. And it's at the point where Mark Subas actually moved him down to the 5th round.
Yeah, Browning is just plunging as he goes.
I think Charlie had a 4th through 6th round grade on him at the beginning of the year, and I thought that was crazy, but now that's starting to look scientifically accurate, even though it's still early.
Yeah, and so we're just going to keep, I think at this point, we're going to keep tabs more on
Browning's
Gaskin than
3rd round prospect, but he's also a guy who I moved from round 2 to round 3, and he's not a guy who's going to go round 1, but he might go day 2 if Washington keeps winning out. But he's looking like a day 3 prospect in terms of performance.
Yeah. And moving on to the game that you and I think both think this may be the, if not the college football game of the week, right up there in the top 3. It's number 7 Michigan falling to 4-1 after losing to Michigan State 14-10, as Michigan State improves to 4-1 and 2-0 in the Big Ten.
Here's a stat. Jim Harbaugh is now 1-4 versus Mark D'Antonio or Urban Meyer in Ann Arbor.
Yeah, unfortunately, that one comes when Michigan was kind of fragile last week. They were very fortunate to get out of that game with a win, and this week they weren't so fortunate. Their
quarterback Wilson Spite broke his collarbone as well.
Yeah, I heard about that, and if you look it up, look up there, John O'Corn, who came in, was 16 for 35, 198 yards, 3 interceptions. He turned the ball over like he was completely unprepared for the game, and Michigan just couldn't get anything started.
In having quarterback problems with Spite being injured, with him being a senior, maybe a junior redshirt, with him being injured, that pretty much takes them out of the playoff picture. I doubt they beat Ohio State now without Spate. I think that's a big loss for them, even though they still have a pretty potent defense. You look at, I think the winner of the Penn State-Ohio State game is probably going to face an unbeaten Wisconsin team in the Big Ten championship this year. It's too early to project, but that's what it's starting to look like.
Yeah, it is, and I think Michigan probably missed a golden opportunity with Ohio State losing early on in the season.
Yep.
Number 23 West Virginia was down by number 8 TCU. We had Will Grier, 25 for 45, 366 yards, 3 touchdowns, and just one heck of a game for West Virginia. The TCU team, they didn't have the offensive support, but the defensive support was all there. TCU scored.
Yes, TCU is still unbeaten, so they're the one team from the Big 12 that can make the playoff at this point. Oklahoma, maybe Oklahoma, but Oklahoma would have to win out, and it would have to be them and TCU. And I don't know if TCU and Oklahoma play in the schedule. I haven't checked that. I don't think we have time to check that this late in the show. So, yeah, we'll move on.
And TCU, I think their defense, 5 quarterback hurries, 6 pass deflections, 3 tackles for loss, 2 sacks. Those guys really powered, along with Nick Orr's interception, that defense powered that team past West Virginia. And
TCU moved up to number 6 in the polls, and they play Oklahoma on November 11th, which could be a preview of the Big 12 championship game set to take place in a few weeks.
Yeah, that'll be a huge game. Number 9,
So Baker Mayfield has home field.
Yes, that'll be a huge game coming up. Number 9, Wisconsin, which you touched on earlier, goes to 5-0 as they beat Nebraska 38-17. Nebraska falls to 3-3. The Tanner Lee from Nebraska, 16 for 32, 262 yards and a touchdown, while Jonathan Taylor for Wisconsin just carved Nebraska to shreds, 25 carries, 249 yards, 2 touchdowns.
Yeah, and Wisconsin has the benefit of not playing Ohio State or Penn State during the regular season. They get Michigan, but they get Michigan at home without Wilson Spite. That's actually a winnable game for them when you consider how well they played defensively versus Michigan last year, only to not execute on offense. That won't be the issue this time around. With Darboh gone, with Chesson gone, with all the weapons Michigan had last year, like Jake Butt gone, with Spite injured, that's not going to be an issue for Wisconsin this time with home field. So them not having to play Ohio State or Penn State is a huge advantage for them. Might not measure well with the selection committee and might keep them out of the top 4, but that's a huge advantage for them because if they are unbeaten heading into the Big Ten championship, and they beat Penn State or Ohio State, that practically guarantees that they're in the playoff. So that's a huge advantage for Wisconsin as far as scheduling goes.
Yeah, it is. And it also plays into the how things are ranked at the top of the top 10. Speaking of which teams that probably have a chance to move into the top 10, Washington State won 33-10 over Oregon to move to 6-0. And the big game, the big story here, I felt, yes, Luke Falk had 3 touchdowns, but I really felt underwhelmed by his performance overall. 24 for 42, 282 yards. He just didn't seem like he brought it this week.
That's true. And the Miami Hurricanes could be unbeaten heading into November with games against Georgia Tech, Syracuse, and North Carolina. Their tough schedule comes in November when they get Virginia Tech in Miami, who's only lost to Clemson. They get Notre at home on the 11th. They get Virginia in Miami, which is a breather game on the 18th, and then they wrap things up at Heinz Field, where the Pitt Panthers play on the day after. It might be Thanksgiving. I don't know if it's Thanksgiving or the day after Thanksgiving, because the Whitfield Championships for high school football are usually the day after on Thanksgiving. And 11/24 is, I think that's around Thanksgiving. So this is going to be interesting to see what happens, because, yeah, I think that they're on the same day. I don't think they would play 4 high school football games on the same day as a Pitt Panthers game at Heinz Field. So I'm going to have to look into that and look into the schedules when I get the chance. But Miami has a chance to run the table if they can get by Notre Dame and Virginia Tech.
Yeah, and here's the thing, speaking from earlier, coming from Seth Walder, ESPN Analytics, after a shocking loss to Iowa State, Oklahoma dropped from number 1 to number 19 in strength of record, which measures accomplishment. In forward-looking FPI rankings, Oklahoma fell 3 spots to number 6. The Sooners were the second biggest favorite, 97% chance to win of the day entering yesterday, but couldn't manage to secure a victory. Now, what this means is State, who lost earlier, moves up.
That's right.
That doesn't just measure on Oklahoma. That drastically affects Ohio State, because the rankings are based on strength of schedule. And Ohio State, if this is any indication, I believe they moved up to 2 based on Oklahoma's loss.
Yes. I can get the official top 25 rankings, the updated top 25 rankings.
Will you do that? We will move on real quick. Try to get a couple more of these games in. The Auburn beat Ole Miss 44-23 to move to 5-1. Shea Patterson for Ole Miss was 34 for 51 yards, 2 touchdowns, where Korean Johnson of Auburn was 28 of 204 for 3 touchdowns. Miami beat Florida State 24-20 in the final seconds in one of the best games of the week, with Miami's Malik Rozier going 19 for 44, 254 yards and 3 touchdowns passing, and Florida State's Cam Akers, 20 carries, 121 yards, and Braxton Barrows from Miami going for 8 receptions, 90 yards, and 2 touchdowns. USC, Sam Darnold had his best game of the year as USC wins 38-10 over Oregon State. Darnold finished 23 of 35, 316 yards, and 3 touchdowns, while Ronald Jones II had 12 carries, 79 yards, and a touchdown, as Oregon State falls to 1-5. USC goes up to 5-1, and Darnold bounces back after 3 extremely disappointing games. Then Texas Tech beat Boston College 23-10. I'm sorry, Grace. Boston College falls to 2-4. Virginia Tech goes to 5-1 in the ACC and 1-1 in the ACC. Josh Jackson for Virginia Tech finished 22 of 33, 322 yards and a touchdown, while Virginia Tech's Trevor McMillan finished with 17 carries, 88 yards and a touchdown. San Diego State, which hosts one of the better receivers in college football, ended up winning 41-10 over UNLV. They're 6-0 at this point. Mika Holder for San Diego State University ended with 9 receptions, 144 yards. And while Rashard Penny had another excellent game with 27 carries, 170 yards, 2 touchdowns. Number 20, Utah fell to Stanford to fall to 4-1 as Stanford moves to 4-2. Notre Dame, number 133-10 over North Carolina. Notre Dame is now 5-1. LSU beat number 21 Florida 17-16 in a squeaker with there's really nothing to note about that game. And number 25 UCF, University of Central Florida, put a whooping on Miami 51-23. 51-23. And that happened in 3 quarters. So, Chris, did you find anything about the top 25? Chris? Okay, we have lost Christopher Ransom. At this point, he was going to search for top 25, the top 25, and now he is gone. So we're going to move on and see what
All right.
Oh, he's back. He's back.
Yeah, my computer was frozen. I didn't lose any data. It just ran out of battery. I had to charge it. That's why I left for a few minutes. But there's 13 unbeaten teams. I looked it up through the FBS. There's 13 teams unbeaten, and every team in the top 8 has 0 losses. So there's 13 total unbeaten FBS teams. All 13 teams are ranked in the top 25. But the 8 teams without a loss at top the FBS are Alabama at 1, Clemson at 2, Penn State at 3, Georgia's moved up from 5 to 4, Washington's at number 5. Despite not playing any quality opponents, they're in the top 5. TCU is at 6, Wisconsin is at number 7, and Washington State is at number 8.
And Washington State is the big one that I am looking at because I really wasn't that impressed. Even though they won this last week, I really wasn't impressed with their win in this last week.
Yeah, and the Pac-12, I'm going to go back to the Pac-12 conference standings because Washington State and Washington are in the same conference in the Pac-12. So the Pac-12 North features both Washington and Washington State. We could realistically see the winner of that game going into that Big Pac-12 championship at 12-0 and losing to the Pac-12 South winner, whether it be USC or UCLA or Utah with their defense. It's not going to be Arizona, even though they're 1-1 in conference play. It's probably not going to be Colorado since they're 0-3 in conference play, and that really hurts Colorado when you consider everyone else at least has one conference win and one conference loss. The Buffaloes being 0-3 pretty much kills their chances of going to the Pac-12 championship. So I think Sam Darnold could beat Washington or Washington State in a rematch. Maybe not Washington State, but I think he could beat Washington in a rematch. If those two teams, if we get a Washington versus USC Pac-12 championship, I still think USC could play spoiler and beat the Washington Huskies. Not sure they'd beat Washington State in a rematch, but I honestly still think USC is still the favorite to win this conference. And I think at one loss, they will find a way to win the Pac-12 because I just don't trust Washington or Washington State in the Pac-12 championship game. Both have been too inconsistent despite getting effective victories.
Yeah, and then we get Ohio State number 9, Auburn number 10, Miami number 11, the aforementioned Oklahoma, who is previously number 3, falls to number 12. Do you think that Oklahoma can still get into the national championship at this point?
Yeah, I would say anyone in the top 13 still has a shot. It's very early in the season, and yeah, I mean, as long as you're in this conversation, you're in the top 25, you've still got a shot. There's a lot of football left to be played, but the teams that don't have losses right now are at an advantage. Alabama's going to be in the playoff. Clemson will probably be in the playoff unless they stumble and lose to NC State, who's number 20 and has no conference losses. Their only loss came to South Carolina in week 1. They've won out every game since then. They beat Florida State. They've beaten a lot of good conference teams. So if they can pull in, but they go to Clemson. They travel to Clemson. So Clemson's probably going to be in the playoff. And if they play Miami, Penn State, they play Ohio State versus 9 on October 28th in Columbus. Last year, that game was in Happy Valley. This year, it's in Columbus. It's in the Horseshoe. So that is a big game for both teams because if Ohio State wins that game, they probably jump up to number 5 because maybe they even move into the top 4, perhaps, Joey, because Georgia would probably be in the top 3 if they're still unbeaten by then. And then you're going to have to decide what's more valuable. This one-loss Ohio State team that lost to Oklahoma early in the year, and they played impressive since, or an unbeaten Pac-12 team like Washington or Washington State, or a Wisconsin team with a weak strength of schedule, or a TCU team with a weak strength of schedule. I think the selection committee is going to value that. And if those teams are still unbeaten at this point later in the year, a lot of those teams are going to be upset if Ohio State is a one-loss team and jumps them. It's going to be a lot like last year, too, when two-loss Ohio State didn't even play in the Big Ten championship, got into the playoffs. So
yeah, if you don't play in your conference championship game, you don't need to be playing in the playoffs.
And Ohio State validated that last year with the 31-0 shutout Clemson handed them. So Ohio State, they're the media darling, but if they beat Penn State, I think they're going to jump a lot of these teams outside of Georgia in the selection committee polls for the playoff selection show, and that's going to upset a lot of the teams, especially if Washington's unbeaten at this point, Washington State's unbeaten. But those teams haven't faced quality opponents, and Ohio State has, and that's one thing that the selection committee is going to favor when it comes to Ohio State.
Yeah, and you also have to look at head-to-head matchups. If you look at Oklahoma and if it comes down to Oklahoma and Ohio State, Oklahoma holds the head-to-head win. And so you have to look at that one as well.
Yeah, if Oklahoma beats an unbeaten TCU team, I think that would put them in a position where they would actually jump Ohio State for the final playoff spot.
Yeah, and number 13, USC. Number 14, Oklahoma State. Number 15, Virginia Tech. Number 16, Notre Dame. 17, Michigan falls from number 7. Number 18, South Florida. Number 19 is one that intriguing. That's San Diego State. Yeah, I like some of their talent. I love their receivers. How far do you think San Diego State can go?
Well, you're looking at four non-Power 5 teams that look like they are in the driver's seat for a New Year's Day bowl game. And those teams are South Florida, 5-0. They're in the same conference as Central Florida, actually. Both of those teams are unbeaten. And I think the reason they didn't play yet is due to the Hurricane Irma. I think that canceled their matchup from earlier in the season. So those teams still don't have a loss. And if those teams are still unbeaten by the time conference championship season arrives, I think the winner of that game could potentially make it into the top 6. I don't think either team's going to get enough love from the selection committee to make the playoff, but if both of those teams are unbeaten by the time conference championship occurs, it could be 7 versus 9 if they're both unbeaten, and I think the winner could do enough to jump into the top 6 or even maybe move up to number 5, but they wouldn't get enough respect to be in the playoff due to not being a Power 5 team, but you never know. And then I think you got Navy, who's unbeaten as well. But San Diego State, like you said, they are the most intriguing of the non-conference unbeatens because they beat Stanford. They handed Stanford their first loss of the season. And they're 6-0. They're running away with the Mountain West. For one team that could challenge them in that conference is Colorado State. Colorado State lost to Alabama, but they were extremely competitive in that game. Their receivers, both of their receivers had 100 yards on Alabama, including Michael Gallup, a guy we've talked about. I don't think we mentioned him in depth yet, but Ryan and I have talked about him quite a bit. We talked about his tape and what he does well. He had 100 yards on Alabama and Minka Fitzpatrick, and he has some good tape. So watch out for Colorado State. I think they're the one team in that conference that has the best chance to keep San Diego State from a perfect season. But right now, San Diego State looks like a team that's on pace to get a New Year's Day bowl bid.
Yeah, and rounding out the top 25, we got number 20 NC State, 21 Michigan State, 21 tied for 21 UCF. Don't see that very often.
Well, Central Florida is in the same conference as South Florida, the All-American Conference, and they beat unbeaten Memphis. That's why they're in the top 25. They beat Memphis and Riley Ferguson. They handed them their first loss. They have a true freshman at quarterback, and they're in the top 25. He's making smart decisions, but he's only like 5'10". He's very skinny. His abilities won't translate to the NFL. But I think it's mainly due to their coach, Scott Frost. He was the offensive coordinator at Oregon when Mariota was there, and he's a very good coordinator, very good at designing plays, offenses, learned under Chip Kelly for many years, learned under the Oregon coach there, the former Oregon coach, and he was a huge innovator in that offense. So Scott Frost is doing things with this Central Florida program, and I'm not surprised by his success because I knew he was going to be one of the bigger hires. So Scott Frost, keep an eye on them. I think the dark horse is NC State because, again, they've beaten Florida State head-to-head already. They've beaten Boston College. They've beaten a lot of teams head-to-head. I think if division over Clemson, and Clemson would be out of the ACC championship, and it would be North Carolina State versus unbeaten Miami, as I told you earlier on the show, Joey, because NC State's a dark horse.
Yeah, and the last 3 teams are 3 teams that are new to the top 25. Stanford gets in at 23, Texas Tech at 24, and Navy at 25. And you jumped the gun on my next question. I was going to ask you which member of those bottom 10 was the dark horse. You got NC State coming in there. So
NC State's a dark horse because of the Bradley Chubb, the defense they have. Ryan Finley's playing well at quarterback. He's going under the radar. They're the dark horse because I think if they beat Clemson, they would mathematically be in the ACC championship, probably versus the Miami Virginia Tech winner. So, and they came within a field goal away from beating Clemson last year before losing to them in overtime. If they don't miss that field goal for their home crowd, they beat Clemson, and Clemson doesn't get in the playoffs. So NC State is not a team to sleep on. They are a very dangerous number 20 team. And if they didn't lose to South Carolina in week 1, this would be a team that's arguably in the top 10 with Miami. So I think they're a team that a lot of people are sleeping on right now. I think the best chance to reach New Year's Day bowl bid among the unbeatens that aren't in Power 5 schools is San Diego State. But again, South Florida plays in the same conference as Central Florida. That's something to keep an eye on, especially if both teams run the table until the conference championship game.
Yeah, and I'm not sure right now.
I'm going to look that up really
What?
quick before we end the
Yeah.
call. South Florida
Okay.
schedule, because that's a big game versus Central Florida whenever
Yeah.
they play.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how that's going to play out in terms of how it's going to
Ooh,
affect the standings.
those teams play November 24th, the week before the conference championship.
Ooh. Wow. Yeah, it's going to be a tough one.
I'm going to look through the conference standings really.
Chris is looking through standings. I think he ran out of battery life again. But I'll say this: we'll go over some on top 25 games here. We got Iowa beating Illinois 45-16. Indiana shutting out Charleston Southern 27-0. Purdue beating Minnesota 31-17. So it was a good week of college football overall, and we're going to look to watch go back and watch some of these games because there were some nice upsets, and the Oklahoma game for me was the biggest upset you could have as to what it did with strength of schedules, which is a huge impact, especially on Ohio State, with Oklahoma going from number 1 to number 19, and then Oklahoma falling from number 3 to number 12, and then USC and what happened with them due to the overall play of quarterback Sam Darnold, which was, in my opinion, his best game of the year. Darnold was a guy that overrated for a while, had high upside, extremely low floor, and the USC winning, and not only them winning, but because they are 5-1, but him coming out and having a 23 for 35 contest really helps him because he goes from having a 1-to-1 touchdown interception ratio to it's still 2-to-1 touchdown, or still 1-to-1 touchdown interception ratio, but he has 12 touchdowns, 9 interceptions instead of 9-9 with 10 sacks. So um, so we're gonna look at we're gonna keep an eye on Sam Darnold, and we're gonna end the show there. And for Chris Ransom, join me. I'm Joseph Potter. Have a nice night and take care.